born July 15th, 1942, right here in Norway at what I believe was called the Penn Hospital. Shortly after I was born, my dad was very concerned about the situation our country was in with World War II, because the bombs had already dropped on Hawaii at that particular point in time. So at some point, because so many young men were volunteering for the service, he did as well, and volunteered for the Army Air Corps. Okay, enlisted in the Flying Cadets of the Army Air Corps at Marinette, Wisconsin, August 6th, 1942. Received my call for active duty on February 2nd to report to Chicago on February 6th. Left my wife and baby home on Friday, left Chicago on February 6th, and arrived in Nashville at 8 a.m. on Sunday, February 7th. Had 3 darn good meals. I went to church at 4 p.m., wrote letters all evening. We are considered quarantined and will be for at least 10 days. I wish I had a goodnight kiss. He went to several bases around the United States for training in various functions of an aircraft. Flying them, learning navigation, learning radio, and I'm sure there were other ones that I'm just not aware of. So he would have to stay on the base for most of the week until my mom or he could somehow find a way to get their car down to Dyersburg. And I'm not sure how that happened yet. I know it's in my father's diary, but somehow she drove a 1937 Ford, but at that time it was only 5 or 6 years old. But nonetheless, even a totally restored car of that age is not that reliable, right? And my mom was tough. And she drove it from Norway, Michigan to Dyersburg, Tennessee. And then we had a vehicle that they could go back and forth so they could all live in the same apartment every day.
I was so motivated by everything I'd found about Joe's military service and talking to his friends and his crewmates. It inspired me to reach out to his remaining brothers and sisters. So I wrote a letter to all of them and said, I'm trying to put together something for my dad. And I think it might have been for my dad's 60th birthday. And I said, if you could share any information, any memories you have about Joe with me. I'm just putting together a scrapbook. And some of the funnier things I remember was my grandfather's parents owned a grocery store. And so he was a delivery boy. And one of Joe's sisters said that she remembered, he said he learned to whistle loudly when making deliveries, because typically he would have to make the deliveries to the back door of a home. And he said one or two times he caught the housewife unaware that he was coming in. And so he thought from now on he's going to make his entrance audible. So he would whistle very loudly from the delivery truck to the back of the home so as not to surprise anybody.
His mom and pop and my mother and me took a train to someplace east of Dyersburg, Tennessee, and visited with my dad for a while. And then he was transferred to another base for more training. This is dated January 21st, 1943. Moved to a new barracks today. Brought all our flying equipment down to the flight line, start flying tomorrow. My first flight in the B-17. Went in town tonight and had supper with Lou and Jeffy. Lou, of course, is my mother, Lucille, and Jeffy is this one here.
And then another one of Joe's sisters, I think it was my Aunt Dolly, said that he would come home late from his band playing days. And she could hear his knees creaking as he climbed the stairs.
Next day, flew today for the first time in the B-17. I sure enjoyed my ride. It's a beautiful ship. We were up for 1.5 hours, had 3.5 hours of ground school this afternoon on combat missions. Got in town to Lou and Jeffy at 7:80 and stayed overnight. Had a more quiet evening together in front of the fireplace. How about that? So that was while he was still in the States going through training. That was one of the bases. They were introduced to the B-17s, and he was told he's going to be a co-pilot. And he was up with a friend at least one time, a guy that he met from Lower Michigan by the name of Bill DeWitt. And they were up in the B-17, I believe, at night, and somehow got their axes crossed and couldn't follow the map back to the base. So they saw a circle of lights down there indicating a city, and took a dive and circled the water tower to find out what city it was, and then they were able to mark their way back home again to the base. I'm not sure if there was a scolding or just a general uproar, but it was kind of an interesting thing to have happen.
She had the diary in her hands at one point, and it might have been something that was given to new enlistees, because the title of the diary says "My Stretch in the Service." So that tells me that this might have been something that was either purchased to, by women, by wives, girlfriends, to give to their husbands or boyfriends when they went in the service. Who knows? But obviously there were a lot of them made. And at some point, she opened it up in the middle and wrote, "When you get here, think of me." And sure enough, in his diary, he got to that point, and he said, "Lou, I think of you every day."
So eventually, he got his orders to go overseas. He had to go to Connecticut, England, and there was an air base there, just as there were in quite a few other small British communities, because the Brits just didn't have nearly as much firepower as we did. So we took them under our wing, and they took us under their wing at the same time. And my father and all the other folks in that group were treated very well by the hometown people.
All these planes had names and nose art, as you've heard, where they painted things on the fronts of the planes, made them interesting and fun, and gave the guys something, because that was their baby,
When you were in those B-17s, in the beginning, you had to fly 25 missions before you could be furloughed. And he got in mission number 10 by May 30th. Up at 3, briefing at 4, and takeoff at 6:45, that's AM. We got back at 1 p.m. It was a milk run to Troyes, France. Really a snap, very little flak, and perfect fighter escort. Very little flak means when they're shooting at you from the ground, it's sort of like shooting mini hand grenades. When the bullet gets up to, I'll call it a bullet, gets up to a certain altitude, it explodes. And that means somebody on the ground has to estimate how far the altitude of the bombers, so that they will explode and shoot small pieces through the sheet metal of the plane. These planes could fly at 35,000 feet, and they were not pressurized, so you had no air in the plane. All the people aboard had to wear oxygen suits and breathe oxygen from the tanks on the plane. That was how they survived. There was one part in here where in his training, he was at 35,000 feet, and something went wrong with it, and he passed out. He lost his oxygen, and one of them, the navigator or something, gave him a nose piece to breathe and wake back up again. So. Mission number 20, he's getting close now to 25. We dropped boxes of ammunition and guns by parachute to French patriots near the Spanish border as we flew over France at 17,000 feet and dropped down to 300 feet to drop our load, 10 or 12 300-pound boxes. It was more like a pleasure trip, no flak, no fighters, but 10 long hours. Saturday, July 15th, 1944, Jeffy's birthday. 2 years old already. Got a letter from Lou today.
In his diary, every day he wrote to Lou at night, wrote to Lou at night. Every day he wrote his wife a letter. And I'm sure she did too.
Here's Friday, July 28th, 1944. Mission number 22 today. Briefing at 2 a.m., takeoff at 5, got back at 1:30. We carried 6 1,000-pound bobs to Meersburg, Germany. Flak over the target was intense and accurate. We had 18 holes in our ship, but got back safe and sound. Saw 2 ships explode in midair over the target. 2 pieces of flak hit our bombs before we dropped them, but luckily they didn't explode. Number 23, Saturday, July 29th. We bombed the same oil refinery at Meersburg, Germany, as we did yesterday. We carried 20 250-pound bombs. The flak was very heavy and accurate, and scares me more and more every time I see it. It's a miracle how we can fly over that stuff and still get back. We lost 2 ships of our group today. I saw 3 ships go down again as the group ahead of us got hit by fighters. It was a 9-hour trip. That's the last thing that he wrote. His last entry was Saturday, July 29th. And he died on Monday, July 31st.
Joe led a really cool life before he was killed. Just to me, fascinating. He had a Joey DeRidder orchestra, worked for his dad. He wrote a letter to George, his brother, while they were in the service. And he said, if we ever decide to get out of the grocery business, I got a great racket for us. I think we could take people on hunting and fishing excursions. I could fly them there. We'll get a plane and I'll fly people there, and then you can teach them how to fish. I mean, he was already thinking of what they could do after the war, as brothers, as a family. And I just thought, wow, how neat would that have been? But his life was cut short, and you know, it affected all of us.
You never know when you're writing these little paragraphs of what happened. You never know what's going to come next. You never know when your last day is. But as he said, it was very heavy. It's a miracle how we can fly through that stuff and still get back.
When his plane went down, my grandmother immediately got a telegram saying he was missing in action, because they didn't know. All they knew was that a plane went down. They had no further details, so until they get absolute confirmation via dog tag or remains, he's missing in action. So she got the telegram. And this I cannot fathom, but for 6 weeks she didn't know, until she was finally told. He was killed July 31st. She got a telegram in early August, and she didn't find out until October that he was definitely killed in action.
A bigger percentage of servicemen were killed in B-17s than in any other vehicle in World War II, any other kind of a vehicle in World War II. Roughly 50% of all B-17s were shot down, exploded. When my dad's plane didn't come back, what was normally the case was to get all of the crew's belongings cleaned out of the barracks where they stayed. When they were in the barracks, they spent very little time socializing with other crews, because you get too close to them and it would be too emotional of a situation when one of them didn't get back. So they weren't close friends. I'm sure they knew who each other was. But when my dad's plane didn't get back, somebody was assigned to take all of their personal belongings and get them the heck out of the barracks, so the barracks could be free, that part could be free for the next crew to come in. Because just like my dad went over there in January, some other people are coming over in July or August or whenever, to get assigned to another ship and go into battle. But it didn't happen right away. John Lina was able to grab this because, as far as he was concerned, it was the most important possession of any of the servicemen. You know, everybody had, who knows, matches, fingernail clippers, glasses. So he grabbed this and hung on to it and was looking through his stuff, because he probably kept a book as well. And he was looking through his stuff, and around 1959 he was going to make contact with my mother. And in the process of doing so, he found out she was just about to be, or just had been, remarried 15 years later. So he didn't want this item to become an issue in her new marriage, so he didn't send it.
The day he died, the day he was killed, the rest of his crew were on a different mission. And so they came back to find out that their co-pilot had been killed that day. And so when my dad talks about John Lina going through my grandfather's footlocker and taking that diary out before they sent the rest of the stuff back, or hung on to it for whatever reason, that was troubling for the crew. They never forgot it.
And eventually John Lina passed away, and when his family was going through his things, his son Bob Lina found it and tracked me down and mailed this to me, which is one of the greatest things in my life.
But all we knew was that his father was killed in World War II. And when you're a kid, that all seems so foreign and mysterious and so long ago. So we didn't know a whole lot. And to be honest, my father didn't know a whole lot. It was painful for my grandmother to talk about. She had remarried, had 2 more children, my uncles. So it wasn't something that we brought up.
I looked at it, I set it down for a little bit because I think I was home for lunch from my employment at Lakeshore, and I believe I came home after supper and just stuck with it until it was done. It was just so amazing to see all that he had done, to see so much of my father's handwriting and all the cute little sayings and phrases that were used in that period of our history. He used the word swell a lot. Instead of saying this is a great person, or this is a lot of fun, or I really enjoy them, he'd say that was swell.
What's interesting about Joe's situation was he wasn't flying with his regular crew the day his plane exploded. And that was something that we learned. Whenever a rookie crew went out, they always had another pilot from another crew, an experienced crew, fly with them for that first flight. Joe was not a pilot, he was a co-pilot. So according to one of the men that we met in one of these military reunions, when they said, we need somebody to fly with this crew for on this day, he said, Joe raised his hand and said, I'll do it. So Joe was not flying with his regular crew. He was flying with a rookie crew. And what we learned was that their plane was called the Devil's Luck. And in that day in formation, they were flying what was called Tail End Charlie. And there were 3 formations of planes. And what that meant was he was flying the lowest plane the farthest back. So the rest of the planes were all farther out and higher up. So that meant they were more prone to attack from behind by enemy fighters, and they were also more prone to ground-to-air anti-aircraft from the ground because they were closest to the ground. And that's precisely what happened. They got near their target of Munich, and it was right over Munich. They got hit. There was a gentleman on another plane very close by who was actually on his last mission. His name was Byron Cook, and he had his camera with him illegally, but he was bound and determined to document his last mission. So because of all the chaos going on, because of all the flak, and there were no fighter planes with them to protect them. They called them their little buddies, the P-51 Mustangs and such. There were none of those that day. Flak was heavy, and it was pretty scary. And this guy had his camera, and he was taking pictures, and somebody said, wow, look at that. That plane got shot. And Devil's Luck had been hit, and I think they were losing engines. They were starting to get wobbly. He snapped some pictures. He went to the other side, took some more, and when he came back, another ground-to-air missile had just come up, and the Devil's Luck had just exploded. He snapped a photo, forever memorializing that plane. We learned there was one man who was able to parachute out of that plane before it exploded. It was hit, and it was struggling, and they were preparing to bail. And one man jumped out. 50 years later, 60 years later, I contacted him. His name was Fred Justice. The last words he heard were my grandfather saying, "Gentlemen, prepare to bail." And Mr. Justice said he stood at the hatch, he had his pack on, and he said there was a hand on his shoulder. The boy who was next behind him, who was also going to jump, he said, "I jumped, and the plane exploded." And he survived. He did spend the rest of the war as a prisoner of war, but he came back home to the States. He was the only survivor. To have that diary returned to the family, and for us to learn everything that we have about Joe in the past 25 years, it's indescribable. You can't put a price on it, and we just don't want Joe to be forgotten. We want the family to know about him. We want the town to know about him, the community. We want the world to know about him, and more importantly, about all of the veterans, just everybody who served. But it needs to be shared. It's one of those horrors of war that people need to see to appreciate what these men, that greatest generation, went through. Tom Brokaw said it best with the greatest generation. These men went through hell, came back and picked up where they left off, and made the country a better place. A sad time, but we're just grateful to have the opportunity to talk about Joe and to keep his memory alive.